How to knit in the round on double-pointed knitting needles for beginners, the 2023 edition. Hi everyone, Norman here. Have you been struggling to knit on double-pointed knitting needles, juggling a full set of 5 needles at the same time, stitches dropping off left and right, then you twisted the cast on, or you end up with ladders all the time? Sounds familiar? Well, in this video I want to show you how I knit on double-pointed knitting needles and why it is my favorite way to knit in the round. Now, this video here will update an older video I had on my channel, and I want to use this opportunity to address the many questions you had in the past 2 years. I'm also using, I hope you can see this, I'm also using a much sharper lens for my camera so you can see all the fine details. Let's dive right into it. For this tutorial, I am using a set of 5 double-pointed knitting needles, 6 inches or 15 centimeters long. For beginners, I recommend bamboo needles. These here are produced by Adi. I'll put a link in the description below. They are very warm to the touch, super light. They have a nice friction, so the stitches don't fall off too easily, and the tips are also not too sharp. Later on, you could definitely use the much faster and typically sharper metal needles, whatever you prefer really. I also love the Knitter's Pride Carbon's DPNs. If your local yarn shop only sells sets of 4 double-pointed knitting needles instead of the standard 5, well, that's okay as well. In this case, I would probably get 2 sets so you have some spares. Knitting with 5 double-pointed knitting needles is typically much easier neater in the long run than with just 4. To start, cast on as many stitches as your pattern requires using a standard long-tail cast on, and then add 1 more stitch. So instead of 36 stitches, I will cast on 37 stitches. I typically cast on around 2 needles to create a stretchier edge. And I won't start with a slip knot when I knit in the round. Instead, I just start with a simple twisted loop. And then I will do the standard long-tail cast on. Depending on your tension, your project, and or your cast on, you may also use just 1 single needle or a needle 1 or 2 sizes larger. I typically cast on all needles or all stitches to 1 needle and then slip them around later on. You can, if you think that is a little bit easier for you, you can also join in the new needles as you go. So you cast on 8 stitches or so, or 10, and then you pick up a second needle. And then you continue casting on around this new needle. And cast on another 8 stitches or 10, whatever you need. And then you join in another needle, and the trick is to distribute the stitches as evenly as possible. And say this was 10 stitches here, and then you join in another needle. I typically don't do this because I feel it stresses these gaps a little bit too much, and often the stitches around the gaps end up a little bit too loose. And another advantage of casting on all stitches to 1 needle is, as I just mentioned, you can use 2 needles to get a stretchier edge. That will be a little bit more difficult if you do it, if you join in the needles as you go, then you would need 2 sets. So here are my 37 stitches, and now I need to distribute them as evenly as possible to my 4 needles by slipping them over 1 at a time. And in my case, each needle gets 9 stitches, except for the very first needle, it will get 3 more stitches, and you will shortly see why. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11. So you slip them over 1 at a time, and you can use this opportunity to recount your stitches. You know, often you cast on 1 stitch too much or so, and this is a good opportunity to recount things so you match the requirements of your pattern. And after each little needle, you slide the stitches here towards the center. From here, I carefully place all 4 needles in front of me like this, and then I check whether I accidentally twisted them around. The cast on should form one continuous untwisted line. Some also call it sunny side up. If you accidentally twisted things and maybe things look like that or so, I don't know, well then untwist it. Once you're satisfied, it's time to pick up your work. So carefully pick it up like this, and then grab your working yarn, bring the yarn to the back, and now we need to join in the round. And to do this, I'm gonna slip this stitch over to my 4th needle, the needle here on the right. Remember, we cast on 1 additional stitch, and now I'm gonna pass this additional stitch here over the one that I've just slipped, and just like that, you joined in the round. Maybe tuck a little bit on the tail. And now I'm gonna knit 2 more stitches, 1 and 2. 2 more stitches to ensure that this gap here, the place where I joined things, isn't here between 2 needles, and this ensures a super neat finish in the end. From here you can pick up your 5th needle and start knitting in the round. To start, you need to bring this needle here to the top. So maybe it's like this. Then bring it to the top. It should rest here. This end should rest on top of the 2nd needle, and this end should rest on top of the 4th needle. Then slide the stitches, if they probably already are there, slide them further to the tip, and then start knitting. After the 2nd stitch, give the working yarn a gentle tuck to close this gap. Don't pull too tight, but a gentle tuck, and don't do this after the 1st stitch. Then continue knitting across the 1st needle. This will probably feel difficult and like things could collapse at any time. Make sure that your needles don't run away and stitches drop off. And you know, I always say it feels a little bit like juggling with raw eggs, and that is quite normal. The first 3 or 4 rounds are always difficult. After that, the actual fabric starts to support the needles and it will be much easier. Once you've finished the 1st needle, it's time to move on to the 2nd needle. You have 1 free needle. Keep it in your hand. It's going to be your next working needle. And then you need to repeat the following couple of steps whenever you change to the next needle. So first, you need to slide these stitches here closer to the center. Then you bring the new needle here, your new stitch holder, so to speak, to the top. So bring it to the top so it rests here on top. Then slide the stitches further closer to the tip. Try to do this by holding things between your fingers and not like this. If you constantly slide the stitches forward like this, your fingertips will start to hurt. And then start knitting. Again, maintain a nice tension, and here after the 2nd stitch, give the working yarn a gentle tuck and then continue knitting. As you knit again, make sure that you don't drop any stitches, balance your project out a bit and knit across this 2nd needle. Then again, rotate your project around, slide these stitches further down so they don't drop, and bring the next needle to the top, just like that. You have your spare needle here, and then continue knitting. Again, tighten up here after the second stitch and knit across. So it should, after a couple of rounds, this will become your new rhythm, and you will very soon do this subconsciously. Slide these stitches to the center, slide these stitches to the top, and bring the needle to the top, and then knit across. Here on the fourth needle, don't forget to tuck on the working yarn. Here on the fourth needle, you may place a stitch marker. So this here is the gap here, and now you may place a little stitch marker to mark the beginning or end of your round, and continue knitting. And the advantage of joining in the round like this is that you really get a super invisible join here, as you can see, with no gap or jog. That is very important. And from here you can continue just like I just showed you. So always bring the yarn to the top and continue knitting. Try to avoid pushing the tips too much. I also do it sometimes, but not all the time. And you can slide the stitches back like that, or you can push the needles like this against the other needle, so you don't end up with, well, bruises or bleeding fingertips because your needles were too sharp and you constantly pushed them. Before we move on, I would like to add a couple of tips and tricks here. You can use any cast on to knit in the round, but as a beginner I would advise to pick one that creates a first row in the same breath, like the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. If you use, say, the single cast on, that doesn't create a first row in the same breath, it will be very, very difficult to avoid twisting, because there is nothing, not even the barest hint of fabric, just this one line here supporting the fabric. And that typically you can't even properly tell. So let's suppose I join in another needle here. What makes things even worse is typically it's very, very difficult to tell if you twisted things or not, because there's just a single thread here in between, and then you don't really know if you twisted things or not. So later on, definitely give it a try, but as a beginner, stick to long tail cast on or German twisted cast on. While I don't do this, some knitters prefer to knit across the first or the first 3 needles flat. And then in the third row, they join in the round by, knitting a couple of stitches with the first needle. Then they join in another needle and sort of transfer the stitches, transfer the stitches to the other needles one at a time. And then when it comes to joining things in the round, you can definitely see if things are twisted a lot better, because there's all that fabric that is a very good visual clue, and on top of that all that fabric will support your knitting needle, so that in this case fourth round will be much easier to knit across. So this can be an option. You will end up with a gap here, and later on you will have to use your cast on tail and a tapestry needle to close this gap and graft a couple of stitches so you don't see it anymore. So just to illustrate, I would propose to go underneath the V here on this side, pull the yarn through, and then find the very first V on the other side, so this here, and then pull things tight, and this will create a rather invisible joint, and then you can continue on doing the mattress stitch here to close this little gap here, and things will be close to invisible but not totally invisible. Some people also cast on one needle and then join in the round as you knit. So you turn your work around and then you knit those 5 or 6 stitches in this case. I'll do 6 and then join in another needle. Now be careful, you will also end up with a little gap you need to close later on, and on top of that, you turn the work around, so this means you are starting your project on the wrong side, and if you want to end up with the same kind of edge and not with purl stitches here or one row of purl stitches below, you would have to pick a cast on for the wrong side as well, so this means a long tail cast on purlwise or a German twisted cast on purlwise, at least if you want to end up with the very same edge we did before. See the difference here? So instead of grabbing the yarn here through the loop around your thumb, you go around the loop around your index finger and grab the yarn from here, and in that manner you could cast on purlwise. Quite the neat trick if you ask me. I'll link you to my full tutorial on how to cast on purlwise up in here. Now, once you are past the first couple of rounds, you will notice that your knitting will start to stabilize your work, and it's a lot easier to handle things. In the first couple of rounds, it always feels like things might collapse at any time. One thing you might consider is you might consider unraveling your project at this point. There's no shame in it, and if you start again, you will be able to incorporate all the things that you've learned in these first couple of rounds for a neater start. But I mean, that's entirely up to you. Just look at your knitting with a critical eye and see, well, is this something I want to continue, or would I benefit from starting over at this point? Another thing you should know is that you can shuffle stitches around at any time. So your goal should be that you have an even number of stitches on all needles. And if you notice, well, I need to shuffle things around, maybe because there's a cable cross in between the gap or whatever, you can always continue knitting with the old needle for a couple of stitches and then switch over to the new needle, and in that manner you can shuffle stitches around the easy way. Of course, you can also slip them over, but if you need to shuffle stitches forward, I think it's a little bit easier to just do it on the go. Your goal should be that you always have an even number of stitches on all 4 needles to ensure that the weight of your work and the force you apply to it as you knit can spread evenly across it. And you don't end up stressing one gap more than the other simply because you have more stitches here on this needle, and then you end up stressing these gaps because it spreads the work outwards. So try to have an equal number or near equal number of stitches on all needles. When it comes to storing your project, I always make sure that I slide all stitches to the center of each needle, and then I fold things like this. By the way, this is another advantage of knitting with 4 instead of 3 needles. And then I just use my working yarn to secure things. I wrap it around a couple of times. You could also use needle stoppers like these to prevent your stitches from falling off. I don't do this, but for a beginner it could be a great help, and they prevent your stitches from sliding off as well. You could of course also knit with these needle stoppers if you are scared of dropping stitches, and always remove the stitch marker from the new needle and attach it to the old needle to stop the stitches from dropping off. I personally don't do this, and I feel, well, it is quite awkward to knit like this, and because you don't only have to shuffle stitches around and the needles, but you also have to manage those needle stoppers, detaching them, attaching them, and that takes quite a long time. So I personally don't do this, but maybe as a beginner it works for you. It certainly could be an option. So maybe give it a try if stitches keep on dropping. Also, please be aware that double-pointed knitting needles come in different lengths. So if stitches keep on falling off, you could pick knitting needles that are slightly longer. There are also shorter needles, like when you want to knit the fingers of gloves or so. And I always say the needles should be long enough to comfortably accommodate all stitches, but not longer, because otherwise you will keep on sliding stitches along all that extra length, and it will take time and mess up your stitch definition. But maybe at the beginning, if stitches keep on falling off the needle, you could pick bigger needles. Another thing that may happen is that as you continue knitting, your knitting looks like this with the purl side here on the outside. And I get this comment so often, and really no worries. What you can always do is you can simply flip things around and invert it. See, I can always do this. And typically you want to keep the knit side on the outside to ensure a neater finish. Just flip it around. There is another important thing I want to address in this tutorial. When you are knitting in the round, then you are not knitting stacks of circles. Instead, you are knitting in an upward spiral. This means if you change colors, the result will always be a little jog. See, here we have a little stair, and that's the result of knitting in an upward spiral. You cannot totally avoid this, but you can kind of cheat. So what you can do is you can knit one full round in the new color, and when you come across the first stitch in the new color, you don't knit it. Instead, you lift the right leg here of the stitch one row below in the old color, in this case in this bluish teal color. Lift it back to the left needle, and then you knit it together with the new stitch. And this will, let me tighten this up, and this will avoid the jog, and it won't be as visible. I'll link you to my full tutorial on knitting jogless stripes in the round with many more techniques up in here. So as you can see, this technique won't fix things totally, but at least it will be a straight line. You still end up with one or two slightly enlarged stitches here, and that will be somewhat noticeable, but you get a nice and neat line. For now, the problem of the jog will probably only concern your bind off. Well, it also concerns the cast on, but the technique I showed you ensured that you don't end up with a jog as you start out. Now you can bind off in the round on double pointed knitting needles using pretty much any technique you prefer. So I'm just doing a standard bind off here, but typically you want to use a stretchier bind off, like the surprisingly stretchy bind off or the lace bind off, things like that, to ensure your cuff, hem, or whatever you're knitting is stretchy enough. So as you can see, if you bind off the regular way, you will end up with a little jog or stair here. That is again a result of knitting in an upward spiral, and this applies to your bind off as well, of course. However, there's a super easy way to fix this. Thread the tail on a tapestry needle. You were going to do this anyway to weave in the tail. And then here on the left side of the gap, find the first little knit V here, this V, and go below it, pull the yarn through. And here on the other side, find the first little knit V, so this V here. Find the first V, pull the yarn through, pull tight, And tada, you already fixed things, and now you only need to bring the yarn to the back by going through the stitch one row below and pull things tight, and there you go. And then you can weave things in the rest of the tail in on the wrong side. Of course, you kind of need to do the same here with your cast on tail. So our join here looks very, very nice, but the tail ends up here in front. So I always bring it to the back like this to create a super, super nice and invisible join. And again, you would have to weave things in here. When it comes to fixing mistakes, you can use a crochet hook to pick up any dropped stitch. I have a full tutorial here on YouTube where I show you how to do that. However, double pointed knitting needles don't have a little lifeline hole here at the end where you can pull through a little bit of dental floss or a fishing line as a safety line where you can always come back to. Double pointed knitting needles don't have a hole here at the end, and even if they did, you couldn't possibly drag the lifeline along. You can, however, use a tapestry needle and some spare yarn in a contrasting color and add a lifeline as an afterthought. So you always go through the right leg of each little knit stitch in a row and pull your tapestry needle through, and in that manner you go all the way around, and then you can safely unravel your project until this point. The stitches are secured and you can pick them up with your needles again. So after all these tips and explanations, I just wanted to knit a couple of rows rather slowly because a lot of people ask me that they have problems with managing the needles and how I do this, and I don't think there is any big secret behind it, but maybe just watching me knit for a couple of rounds like this will help you. So it really boils down to bringing the working needle to the top, and that's basically everything I do. Where you need to pay attention to, sometimes as you switch from one needle to the next, you catch the yarn here on top of the needle, and then you create a yarn over here. So always make sure that the yarn, the working yarn, stays below as you switch to another needle. And then of course tighten up after the second stitch. And the trick to avoiding ladders when knitting in the round really boils down, a lot of people, what you need to realize is that pulling too tight, knitting too tight can be as much as a problem as knitting too loose. So that's why I said tighten up after the second stitch, but don't tighten up too much. And other than that, it really boils down to practice and patience. My first projects in the round weren't perfect either, but now, ladders, I hardly know her. It's just, at one point it will become quite natural, and maybe you can see that as I proceed here knitting, that my knitting starts to stabilize and things don't hang down anymore all that much. It's rather stable, and around this point things really start to get easier. And I do feel that a lot of beginners give up on double pointed knitting needles too early. The thing about knitting in the round with circular needles, and magic loop certainly is an option, is that it is very similar to flat knitting, and that's why it may feel a little bit easier to beginners. However, double pointed knitting needles, that is a whole new set of skills you need, and that takes time to learn, and you need to push through that. So your first project or your first two projects on double pointed knitting needles will feel a little bit awkward and the results may not be so good, but after your 10th project or so, it really will become a second nature to you. And yeah, You need to push through that, just like you pushed through knitting that first pot holder, dishcloth, whatever you knitted. It will take a little bit time, but then you will thoroughly enjoy the versatility of double-pointed knitting needles compared to circulars or magic loop technique, which is often a lot more limited in your possibilities. Anyway, that's how to knit in the round on double-pointed knitting needles. My next video will be all about tips and tricks when knitting in the round on DPN, so definitely stay tuned and consider subscribing to my channel if you aren't already. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day!